Our story begins with Margaret, an elderly widow in her late 70s, living alone in a modest suburban house. Her husband, Frank, passed away 10 years ago, and her children live in distant cities. Margaret finds solace in her daily routines, gardening, baking, and occasionally volunteering at the community center. Despite her quiet life, she's known for her warm heart and unwavering kindness. Margaret first notices the homeless man, Ben, on her weekly trips to the grocery store. He's always sitting on the same park bench near the store, clutching a worn backpack and staring into the distance. His appearance, ragged clothes, unkempt beard, and weary eyes, stirs a deep sense of compassion in her. One day, on a whim, she bakes an extra loaf of bread and packs it with some fruits and snacks. On her way to the store, she hands the bag to Ben, who looks startled but grateful. At first, Ben says nothing, merely nodding his thanks. Margaret doesn't press him, she simply smiles and walks away. This exchange becomes a ritual. Every day, Margaret prepares a small meal and leaves it for Ben on the bench. Sometimes he's there to accept it in person, other times, she leaves it on the bench for him to find later. Slowly, Ben begins to open up, offering quiet thank yous and shy smiles. Margaret doesn't pry into his past, respecting his silence. One rainy afternoon, Margaret notices Ben is absent from the bench. Concerned, she searches the nearby streets but finds no trace of him. She returns home, worried, but continues to prepare the daily meals just in case. 2 days later, Ben reappears, visibly weaker and shivering. Margaret approaches him cautiously, offering him a thermos of hot soup and a thick blanket she no longer needs. Ben accepts them with trembling hands, his voice breaking as he whispers, "Thank you." Margaret decides to involve the community center, subtly inquiring about resources for the homeless. She's met with bureaucracy and indifference, but she doesn't give up. Meanwhile, her neighbors begin to notice her daily interactions with Ben. Some applaud her kindness, while others warn her against attracting trouble. Margaret ignores the negativity, driven by an unshakable belief in helping someone in need. As we continue with this heartwarming story, we would appreciate if you hit the subscribe button to support this channel, and do not forget to turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories. Thank you. One evening, Margaret finds a folded note tucked under the empty food container she had left for Ben. Curious, she opens it to find a message written in shaky handwriting. "Your kindness has given me hope. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not a problem. Tomorrow, I'll tell you my story." Margaret is deeply moved and looks forward to their next encounter with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Ben's backstory is one of deep loss and quiet resilience, marked by profound loneliness but also quiet dignity. Ben was once a devoted husband. He and his late wife, Eleanor, were high school sweethearts who shared a modest, joyful life filled with simple pleasures. Together, they had a daughter, Grace. Tragically, Grace passed away in her teenage years due to a rare illness, a loss that profoundly affected Ben and Eleanor. Years later, Eleanor lost her life in a car accident, leaving Ben without any close family. These losses led him to retreat from society, though he never gave up entirely on life or his quiet sense of kindness. Meanwhile, Ben had no close living family. His parents passed away years earlier, and he was estranged from distant relatives. While this isolation was a significant source of pain, it also contributed to his unassuming and reflective demeanor. Ben chose to focus on surviving day by day, often spending time in the library when it was open and trying to remain unseen in public spaces. The next day, Ben shares his story with Margaret. "I was once an architect, with my family and a promising career. A series of personal tragedies happened: the death of my wife in a car accident, the passing of our only daughter before that, the loss of my job during a recession, and a spiral into depression led me to the streets." He reveals that he'd lost faith in humanity until Margaret's daily acts of kindness rekindled a spark of hope in him. Margaret listens intently, tears streaming down her face. She encourages Ben to seek help and offers to assist him in finding resources. Ben hesitates, admitting he's afraid of being judged or dismissed. Margaret assures him he's not alone and promises to stand by him. Margaret's children, Rachel and Thomas, who were living in different cities, occasionally visit or call to check on their mother. Their primary concern was always her well-being, given her advanced age. They had their perspective and reactions regarding her growing friendship with Ben. Rachel and Thomas were naturally cautious about their elderly mother befriending a homeless man. They trusted their mother's judgment but worried about her vulnerability, especially since they lived far away and couldn't be physically present to support her. Their concerns arose when Margaret mentioned Ben during phone calls and their occasional visits. Initially, they questioned her decision to send food to him daily, suggesting she might be putting herself at risk. Margaret's reassurance that Ben was respectful, kind, and grateful eased some of their worries. However, when Margaret revealed that she had started helping Ben more directly by providing him with small items like clothes and books, Rachel and Thomas became uneasy. During one visit, Rachel and Thomas voiced their concerns about Margaret's safety. Rachel suggested that while helping others was noble, it was essential to exercise caution, especially with strangers. Thomas, who tended to be more pragmatic, went as far as offering to pay for professional support services if Margaret truly wanted to help someone in need. Margaret responded with her characteristic warmth and determination, assuring her children that she felt safe around Ben and had never once doubted his intentions. She also explained that Ben had shared pieces of his life with her, including his past and his late wife, which gave her confidence in his character. The story takes a dramatic turn when Margaret's nosy neighbor, Mrs. Carter, reports Ben to the authorities, claiming he's the danger to the neighborhood. When Mrs. Carter noticed the steady stream of food Margaret provided to Ben, this alone might not have raised concern, but when she saw Ben rummaging through a nearby trash bin one evening, she became convinced he might be up to no good. She called the police, claiming she had seen Ben snooping near houses in the neighborhood. She insisted that he was likely planning a break-in or that Margaret was somehow being manipulated by him. Police arrive, and an altercation ensues. When the police confronted Ben near the park bench where he often ate Margaret's meals, they initially treated him with suspicion. They asked him where he was living and demanded to know why he was loitering in the area. When Ben explained that Margaret had been helping him, they became more cautious but still suspicious. They implied that there had been complaints of a potential burglar in the area. Luckily for Ben, Margaret had just arrived too to give him some meals. Margaret intervenes, standing defiantly between Ben and the officers. She argues passionately, highlighting Ben's humanity and the importance of compassion. She explained to the officers that Ben was not a criminal but a kind soul who had been dealt a hard hand in life. Ben, visibly shaken but composed, told them his story, how he had fallen on hard times, the kindness Margaret had shown, and his efforts to keep to himself. His honesty and demeanor eventually softened the officers' stance, though they still felt obligated to follow up on Mrs. Carter's report, but the officers leave without taking Ben into custody. Margaret's defense was so passionate and heartfelt that it swayed the officers and even led to an apology from one of them. This incident, while upsetting for Ben, further solidified the bond between him and Margaret. It also sparked Margaret's realization that society needed to do better for people like Ben, prompting her eventual decision to advocate more actively for homeless individuals in her community. When Rachel and Thomas learned of the incident with the police, their concern grew significantly. Rachel, in particular, felt that the situation confirmed her fears about the unpredictability of befriending a stranger. She became more vocal about Margaret needing to distance herself from Ben. Thomas suggested involving local charities to ensure Ben got help without Margaret having to directly intervene. Margaret, however, stood firm, explaining how unjust the situation was and emphasizing how Ben had become a dear friend, not just someone she was helping out of pity. She pointed out that the nosy neighbor's actions caused the incident, not Ben's behavior. Margaret's passion and unwavering defense of Ben slowly softened her children's stance. Meanwhile, Margaret's actions draw media attention. Someone had quietly recorded the altercation and the intervention of Margaret and posted on social media. This was how a local journalist got hold of the story, portraying Margaret as a modern-day Good Samaritan. Donations and offers of assistance pour in, enabling Ben to access medical care and temporary housing. Inspired by the community's response, Margaret spearheads a campaign to support other homeless individuals, partnering with local organizations to create a lasting impact. As Ben begins to rebuild his life, he and Margaret form an unbreakable bond. He helps her with household chores and shares his architectural skills by designing a community garden for the neighborhood. Margaret, in turn, finds a renewed sense of purpose and joy. Over time, as Ben began to rebuild his life with Margaret's support, Rachel and Thomas saw the positive change he brought to their mother's life. She seemed more energetic and engaged, often sharing stories of Ben's small acts of kindness and their shared love of books and gardening. Eventually, during a family visit, Rachel and Thomas met Ben in person. His polite demeanor, humility, and heartfelt gratitude for their mother's kindness melted away much of their suspicion. While they remained cautious, they respected their mother's independence and judgment. In a heartwarming twist, after receiving Margaret's support and re-establishing some stability, Ben took a bold step toward rebuilding his life further. He traveled to a neighboring city to take up a job opportunity arranged through the social worker Margaret had connected him with. One morning, Margaret receives a letter from Ben, who has moved to a nearby city to take a job at an architectural firm. Enclosed is a sketch of a house with a beautiful garden dedicated to Margaret. The letter reads, "You saved my life. This is my dream now, to create spaces filled with kindness, just like you." Margaret smiles through her tears, her heart full of pride and gratitude. Ben's time away allowed him to rebuild his confidence, save money, and start looking toward the future with renewed hope. Though physically distant, he maintained contact with Margaret through letters, which became a lifeline for their enduring friendship. On a hopeful note, Margaret continues to tend to her garden, surrounded by neighbors and volunteers inspired by her example. Here you have a vibrant community that grew from one woman's simple act of kindness. And a few years later, Ben decided to return to the city where Margaret lived, but not as a man in need. This time, he returned as someone with the means and determination to honor the kindness that had been shown to him. Ben's return coincided with a community event at a local park, a fundraiser Margaret was hosting for a charity she had founded to help the homeless and vulnerable. When Ben arrived at the event, he quietly blended into the crowd before walking up to Margaret with a small bouquet of flowers he had grown himself. The moment was emotional. Margaret, overwhelmed with joy, embraced Ben as if welcoming back a family member. Ben didn't just return to reconnect with Margaret, he wanted to give back. With the skills and stability he had developed, he volunteered to work with Margaret's foundation. He became an integral part of the organization, using his resources and experiences to mentor others facing similar challenges. Ben also decided to settle permanently in Margaret's city, finding a modest home, since his company has acquired an office in the same city as Margaret's. His presence brought immense joy to Margaret, her children, and the broader community, who admired his resilience and transformation. Ben's return symbolized not just a personal triumph, but also the power of compassion and community to change lives. It gave Margaret the reassurance that her acts of kindness had ripple effects far beyond what she had imagined. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to Home of Stories TV. And do not forget to turn on the notification bell for more inspiring stories. Drop your comments below, let us know your thoughts.